This is Math 2, 3.4 Notes. That's Unit 3, Lesson 4. Okay, we're going to title it Using Corresponding Parts of Congruent Triangles. Okay, first things first, what do we remember back from Lesson 3.1? We learned that, let's write this down, if triangle ABC is congruent to triangle HJK, then all corresponding parts were congruent. And it went the other way. In order for two triangles to be congruent, all corresponding parts and corresponding angles must be congruent. So if I gave you this statement like this, we can conclude, let's write this down, that angle A is congruent to angle H. We don't need the image drawn for us. We can also conclude that angle B is congruent to angle J. Got my angle marking there. So A was congruent to A, B is congruent to J, and angle C is congruent to angle K. We can also conclude corresponding segments, corresponding sides. So AB is congruent to HJ. Again, all of this is without the picture. BC is congruent to JK. And where's our third side? We don't have, I did the first two, the last two, it's the last and the first. CA is congruent to KH. You could have put AC is congruent to HK or KH. The order doesn't matter when naming a segment. Okay, what does all of this mean? All of this here, those are corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. This is what we're talking about when we say corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. We're going to use this a lot from here on out. So what is meant by this statement is that if two triangles are congruent, all the corresponding angles are congruent, as well as their corresponding sides are congruent. All right. Number 1, given angle B is congruent to angle X, BC is congruent to XC, prove AB is congruent to YX. All right, let's draw our image. We're going to draw that bow tie again that we've been drawing in class. And we are going to label it A, B, C, X, Y. All right, let's mark what's given. Angle B is congruent to angle X. BC is congruent to XC. Prove that AB is congruent to YX. Now, here is the deal. Look at what we're trying to prove. We're not trying to prove the triangles are congruent. We're trying to prove that parts of the triangle are congruent. So, what you have to do when you're trying to prove either sides or angles of a triangle are congruent, you must first prove that the two triangles are congruent. All right, so when you're working with proving sides or angles are congruent, you must always first prove the triangles are congruent. Let's write that down so we don't forget. We need to first prove the two triangles are congruent. triangle. Now, they didn't give us a triangle statement, so we have to make up the first one on our own. The first one doesn't matter the order, so I'm just going to put ABC. You could have put CBA. Doesn't matter. But since I've chosen ABC, my next one needs to go in order, and I'm going to put this in pencil. We know that. We know that those are vertical angles, so I'm going to go to mark them now. So, ABC, no angle marking, 1, 2. None, 1, 2. We would say YXC. YXC. We need to first prove that these two triangles are congruent. Once we're able to prove that, we can then say AB is congruent to YX because they're corresponding parts of two congruent triangles. So for this first one, we're going to go just like talk it through. We're not going to do a two-column proof. So what would we do? What can be said? That's already given. Those two angles are congruent. Those two sides are congruent is already given. The pencil marking's not, so that's what we would need to say. We would say angle ACB is congruent to angle YCX or XCY. And why are those two angles congruent? I'm going to put B/C for because vertical angles are congruent. That's nothing new. We've known that already. Those two angles are congruent because vertical angles are congruent. Now look at your markings. Do we have enough to say the two triangles are congruent? We sure do. Triangle, it's right there, ABC is congruent to triangle YXC by, what's the reason? There's an angle, and a sandwich that's a side that is sandwiched. An angle, and a side that is sandwiched. So we would say by angle, side, angle. All right. Typically, we're done after we've proved the triangles are congruent. But recognize we're not trying to prove the triangles are congruent. We're trying to prove that sides are congruent. So we needed to first do this. Now, after you prove the triangles are congruent, you can now say what you're trying to prove. I'm going to put this symbol here. That means therefore. Dot, 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 like this is therefore. Therefore, AB is congruent to YX because, and it's this long reason here, we'll try to shorten it a little bit, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. That's it. So AB, the first two, are congruent to YX, the first two. Why? Because the two triangles are congruent. We weren't given that. We had to first prove it. Once we proved it, we then can say what we were trying to prove, that AB is congruent to YX. Got it? I'm going to put a little parentheses here just in case. You will see this. So you know CP, CTC. You're not allowed to use that shortcut. You're just not. I want to see this out. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. But on state test or even our own quizzes and tests in this classroom, you'll see this sometime, like on a multiple choice. It'll say fill in the blanks with the proof, or somewhere along there you'll have to multiple choice, and it'll say CPCTC. You should know that stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, but again, we don't write that. We see it, we know what it means, and that's it. Okay, let's go ahead and try a proof. Number 2. Given WX is congruent to ZY and WZ is congruent to XY, prove angle W is congruent to angle Y. And before I go further, you will have some on our classwork where you're just writing like a paragraph type proof. You're just writing out what you're doing. And then you'll have some like this where the two-column proofs like we're used to, and I will walk you through them. Okay, let's draw our image. It's going to be a parallelogram type quadrilateral. And XW XWYZ. And I'm going to fix these up here. Actually, I'll just put this back the way it was. Sorry. XWYZ. All right. Given WX is congruent to ZY. Oh, one piece I forgot to draw was the diagonal going from Z to X. Okay. WX is congruent to ZY. WZ is congruent to XY. Prove the two angles are congruent. So we're not trying to prove the triangles are congruent. We're trying to prove two angles in the two triangles are congruent. So if you're trying to prove angles are congruent or sides are congruent, you're going to be ending with the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So let's try to set this up. Statement, reason, and number one, we should always know is whatever the given information is, WX is congruent to ZY, and WZ is congruent to XY. And what's the reason? Given. Okay. Now, whenever you're trying to prove that parts of the triangle are congruent, whether they're angles or sides, I've already stated this before, you will always first need to prove the triangles are congruent. So that's our first goal. Are these two triangles congruent? Right now I have side, 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 side. Side, side is not enough, but I'm hoping you recognize that this right here is reflexive property. So we have enough to say the two triangles are congruent. So let's put that there. The pencil marking there was not given, so I need to state it. XZ is congruent to XZ. And why is it congruent to itself? That's the reflexive property. All right, do we now have enough markings to say the two triangles are congruent? Those two and those two were given. That's up here. I added the pencil one in here with reflexive property. We do now have enough information to say the two triangles are congruent. Now, they didn't give us letters, so we're going to come up with the first three. Let's do XWZ. Now, when you're doing this on your own, if they don't give you the first statement, you do have to come up with it on your own. XWZ. Now, someone else could have said WXZ or ZWX. Your first one is up to you, but the second one specifically has to follow the first one. So I did XWZ, single side, double side. So if I went single side in that way, that's wrong because that's triple. So XWZ, XWZ, single, double, I have to go single, W. So that's ZYX. And what's the reason? Look at all your markings. We should know it's because of side, 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 congruency. Now, typically we'd be done. Side, 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 angle, we're done. But keep in mind, I wasn't only trying to prove the triangles are congruent, I'm trying to prove that parts of the triangle are congruent. Let's look at our statement. W, sure enough, matches with the Y. So if these two triangles are congruent, then those two corresponding angles are congruent. So we can now say that angle W is congruent to angle Y because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. That's about as shorthand as I'm going to allow you to go. You cannot do the CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, that is it for this lesson. We'll talk more about this in class.